Good evening. If you'll be turning to your New Testaments, to the book of Matthew, chapter 23, that's where our text is going to be for our lesson tonight. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 23, and we're going to end up reading most of that chapter in the course of our study together tonight. In Matthew 23, you're probably most familiar with this text as Jesus talks about the woe to the scribes and Pharisees. These should have been the legal experts in the law. These should have been the folks that they could look to and say they know what they're talking about, they know what they're doing, but yet Jesus exposes their hypocrisy and exposes their error in this text. Let's just read the first few verses to get a feeling for what's going on here. It says, Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore all they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplace and being called rabbi by men." I'm confident that someone, at least living in their time, would look at this and say, well, it's about time that somebody told these guys. Yeah, let's tell them. We appreciate Jesus jumping on the bandwagon here and getting on to these folks. That may be true that they needed to hear that, but it was probably also something that horrified these people to hear Jesus talking to them in that way, and horrified many of the Jews to hear their leaders be reprimanded by Jesus. The fact of the matter is, it wasn't Jesus' intent to necessarily try to go about reprimanding them or necessarily trying to build them up. The focus that he's trying to do is to teach truth. And if what they were teaching and practicing was truth, Jesus has no issue with that. But if what you're doing and practicing and teaching is not truth, then Jesus takes issue with it. That would be a good definition to work through as to what Jesus is doing when he's loving brethren. It's not all hearts and rainbows and Cupid and that sort of thing, but he's telling them these are the things that you're doing and they don't align with what the truth is. They should be teachers of the law, and they're not teaching the law in the sense of they're not living it. They're living hypocritically. The idea, I think, of what Jesus is trying to do in this text is to get them to wake up. Get them to recognize what they're doing wrong and then to make correction. We don't use the word woe very much, I think. It's probably more common than some words that we use. But if you look in Webster's dictionary, you find the second definition. The first one doesn't fit the context at all. But the second definition that's used there is ruinous trouble. Ruinous trouble. And I had to go say, well, what do you mean by ruinous? The idea is that it is an interjection of grief, or denunciation is the way that Thayer's puts it. If you compare in Luke chapter 6, you will find a comparison between the idea of woe and the idea of being blessed. So if you think about, for example, just the Beatitudes and all the different ways that Jesus talks about being blessed, this is kind of the opposite of that. If you think about the idea of being blessed in a positive sense, you can think about woe as being that in a negative sense. That you're not in the good side of God. You're not before a God who is happy with you. That's what the scribes and Pharisees are dealing with. They're in a situation where they're not pleasing before God. Look in verse 13. You skip down to verse 13. You see this one as it begins. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the whole kingdom of heaven for people, but you do not enter it yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering it to go in." It seems to be that not only do they teach people the wrong things, as we'll see just in a few minutes, but they also discourage and into some sense abuse those people who were headed down the right track. That is, if you were doing what was right, they tried to dissuade you away from that, to follow after what it was that they were teaching, to drag people down who were actually coming to know God and coming to his kingdom. We've been talking about one individual who was a Pharisee, and I don't actually think he fits this mold here as to what Jesus is talking about. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, but that's Nicodemus. We noticed him in Bible class this morning in John chapter 3 and in the first two verses, where he's a Pharisee identified in verse 1, and he comes to Jesus at night in verse 2, and says, we know that you've come from God as a teacher. He identifies him as rabbi. For no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. So it seems to be this Pharisee, Nicodemus, was at least willing to understand truth and willing to lend an ear to truth. Look over to John chapter 7 to learn a little bit more about these Pharisees and a little bit more about Nicodemus too. John chapter 7, and I want to read starting in verse 45. John 7, verse 45 says, the officers then came to the chief priests and Pharisees, and they said to him, why did you not bring him? The officers answered, never has a man spoken the way this man speaks. And the Pharisees then answered them, you have not also been led astray, have you? That was, they thought that if you followed after Jesus, you were being led astray. No one of the rulers of the Pharisees has believed in him, has he? Well, that would include Nicodemus. This crowd, which does not know the law, is accursed. Nicodemus, though, verse 15, he who came to him before, being one of them, said to them, our law does not judge a man unless it first hears from him and knows what he is doing, does it? And they answered him, you're not also from Galilee, are you? Search and see that no prophet arises out of Galilee. And everyone went to his home. In asking Jesus the questions that he does in John chapter 3, he strikes me as a man who's seeking out truth. And in John chapter 7 here, it seems at least that Nicodemus is giving somewhat of a mild defense of Jesus. I wouldn't say this is a defense of him, but at least hey, we don't want to condemn him just yet. Let's give him some, we'd call it due process today. Let's actually figure out if that's what's going on and identify it just a little bit more thoroughly. It seems like when you read in John chapter 19 that he may be a sympathizer. Hopefully, I want to think that Nicodemus is a disciple. I don't know one way or the other whether he is or isn't. But here in John chapter 7, the Pharisees are trying to discourage Nicodemus, trying to discourage him from finding out what's truth, trying to discourage him from actually going through and following it. What do we do when we think about a challenge? When someone challenges our thinking and challenges what we're trying to do in figuring out truth, how do we view that? Are we like these Pharisees in John 7 and verse 52? You're not also from Galilee, are you? You need to figure that. Come on, Nicodemus, get it straight and figure it out. What they're really saying to Nicodemus is, you be quiet. We've got everything settled. We've got everything figured out. You just need to stop speaking in his defense. What would our attitude be? What is our attitude? It may be that we have the same attitude. When someone challenges our thinking or challenges our truth, we just answer back and we say, oh, you're one of those, aren't you? You're one of those. You just need to go study your Bible and you need to go figure it out on your own. That's what the Pharisees are telling Nicodemus in John 7 and verse 52. You need to go examine the facts. Once you examine the facts, you'll find out I'm right and you're wrong. Is that our attitude? That it's all about what I say goes and what I think's right, and I never have to figure out one way or the other on my own? I just listen to someone else? These Pharisees that Jesus is proclaiming this woe to are doing that very thing. They're discouraging those who are trying to get on the right track. Jesus tries to help people get on the right track. He spends time with sinners and teaching sinners and trying to persuade them, trying to get them to come out of sin into a relationship with God. But the Pharisees are on the other end of that. They discourage people who are honestly seeking after truth. How do I treat people who are seeking after truth? Do we say, you just need to go figure it out on your own? Or do I say, let's go sit down and look at the Bible together? Which am I? Back to our text in Matthew 23, look at verse 14. You'll notice that verse 14 is in brackets. And if you'll read the footnote probably that you have there in verse 14 to figure out why the brackets are there, it'll tell you that this verse is not in early manuscripts. So we ought to just clip it out of our Bible, right? No. The exact phrasing, the wording that we have here in statements are given in Mark chapter 12 and verse 40 and Luke chapter 20 and verse 47. Now, I have no question about the authenticity of this particular statement. We can go read it in those two texts if you'd prefer, but the same idea is here in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 14, or Matthew 23 and verse 14, where it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation." Devour widows' houses. I'm not sure if I know exactly the specifics as to what he's talking about here, but in some sort of way, they were defrauding others, they were taking advantage of others, and he specifically mentions widows in this context. Well, in their society, the widows were of great need. The way that their culture was set up, the way the society, government, all that stuff was set up, the widows were of a sense needing to be served by others, needing to be helped of by others. They were in a very vulnerable position. The scribes and Pharisees should have instead had that idea of, we need to help these widows, so we're going to jump in and lead the charge. And we're going to be right there to help and get that issue taken care of. Now, whether that's what he's talking about or not, I'm not sure, but it seems that at a minimum they're taking advantage of the vulnerable. You can say they're abusing them in that particular sense. And then guess what else they're doing in verse 14? For a pretense you make long prayers. So put those two together. You're taking advantage of the vulnerable, and then you're turning yourself around and you're going out in the street where everybody can see you, and you're making these long prayers, and you're trying to show everybody just how righteous and how good you are. But you really are actually selfish. You want to act righteous, you want to give a good show, but actually deep down it's all about you. We can have this same attitude where we hypocritically worship God. And we may sing out, but yet we live a life of true selfishness. In everyday life, we actually are just worried about ourselves. Hopefully we're not devouring widows' houses, but we can do it in just small things that we're doing, that we are selfish about, that we lay back and we don't do actually what God wants us to do and work in His kingdom. We may say, I'll let somebody else handle that. I'm not going to contact the visitors, okay? Somebody else can handle that. I got to get to lunch. I've got something else I've got to do. I know Sister so-and-so needs encouraging, and somebody ought to do that, just not me. I know we need teachers, but that takes a lot of time. Somebody else can do that, not me. Somebody else can sacrifice their energy to do things. Is it not the same thing when we don't look to ourselves as to what we can do in service of the Master, and instead we look to others because we've got something else that's more important to us? We can just act like Christians, or we can actually be Christians. We don't want to be like these scribes and Pharisees that make a good show of righteousness, but actually are selfish. Verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself. That's pretty strong language that Jesus uses in verse 15, isn't it? That you go out and you spend all this effort, and you spend all this time and energy to go and to make one proselyte, and when you travel to the ends of the earth, whatever you need to do, you get one convert, and as soon as you get him, you start teaching him things that are wrong. We know in Matthew chapter 15 that they were shown to be teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. It seems to me that's their M.O. That they go about and they say, this is the way we've done it, this is our traditions, this must be law. They taught it as law, and therefore when they go out to make a proselyte, they go out and make a convert, and they teach them those things. You teach them the wrong things. And he puts it this way, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. You know, we can do that too. We could be the very ones that Jesus is talking to here. We go out and we try to teach people the gospel. And we have responsibility to teach as we have opportunity, availability to do it. But if we're trying to help someone be converted to Christ, what are we trying to help them to be? Are we trying to teach them some preacher's belief? This is what my preacher said. Is that what we're trying to teach them? I don't know what Church of Christ doctrine is. In the sense of some officialdom, I don't know what that is. I understand what people mean when they use those terminology. I'm just saying that there's not something that's a creed book that is set by a denominational hierarchy that says this is what we're going to do. Are we trying to convert people to Church of Christ doctrine? Or are we trying to teach people truth about Christ and our need for the Savior? I'm not sure that there's anything more important to consider that we need to be concerned about when we're talking to others about the gospel. Paul, time and time again, talked about this need to teach the Lord to people, to teach Christ to people. After Philip met the eunuch in the chariot in Acts chapter 8, and you remember what it said after they read in Isaiah, and we're talking about Isaiah? He said he started from this point and preached Jesus to him. That's all we need to be teaching people. We just need to teach people about Jesus and who Jesus is. Now, I recognize some of the folks we look at speak from inspiration. Absolutely, they're inspired apostles and those sort of folks. But that doesn't mean that we can't use truth because we're not inspired. I don't know about you. I'm just going to say it plainly. I don't want to be a son of hell. And I don't want anybody else to be a son of hell. And I don't want to be twice as much a son of hell. And so I want to stay far away from that. I don't want people to be converted to be twice as much a son of hell as me. Instead, let's just focus on teaching the Bible and using the Bible to convert people to Christ. Let's read in verse 16. He says, "Woe to you blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. Whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the offering on it, he's obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sacrifices the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears both by the altar and by everything on it. Whoever swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these things are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow the camel." I need to put this together with Matthew chapter 5. So just hold a marker there, and let's put this together in Matthew chapter 5 to get the full picture. Matthew 5, and I'm looking at verse 33 and a few verses following that. So Matthew 5, beginning in verse 33. It says, "You've heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond this is of evil." I'm trying to get a picture as to how these people were behaving and what it was that's the issue at hand. It seems to me that they go about and they make an oath and they say, "I swear by heaven that I'm going to do this." And if we say that, "I swear by heaven," it's as if we're using heaven as the collateral that we'd put up for that. That if we don't follow through, what are we going to do about that? We have no right to heaven as it is. We have no right to negotiate with it in that sort of way. You have no power for that. He says you can't even swear by the hair on your head because you cannot make one turn white and you can't make one turn black. I have no control over those particular things that just happened. Instead, Jesus says, here's the idea. You're a kingdom citizen, tell the truth. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And when you say what you say you're going to do or you're not going to do, keep your word. You don't need to go about making some sort of vow. And so that's the idea in Matthew chapter 5. Look back to Matthew chapter 23 and in this text that we were just reading. He goes through all these examples of what they were doing. They swear by the temple, they swear by the gold, they swear by the altar and the sacrifice, all that sort of stuff. But when you get down to verse 23, he says, you tithe the mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These things are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You start focusing on these little things here. I'm not trying to make some false distinction here, is what Jesus is making the point of. He's saying you stop playing games. You're playing games with these vows. And you tell me which is more important, the sacrifice or the altar? The gold in the temple or the temple? The way they were understanding it is well, it's not really real. It's not really real, but yet here's what you do. Here's what you do. You go into your pantry, and when it's time to make the tithe, you start going through your spices. You go through the mint and the dill and the cumin, and we've got a pantry. We've probably got all these spices in there. You ever tried to take and be sure that you separated out all the mint and you got 10%, just got 10% of it? We got to take that and set it to the side. Or you took the dill and you found the little leaves of dill and you got 10% out of that, of the cumin. You were going through, you Pharisees, and you were being sure that you got these little bitty things all handled. And guess what you missed? You missed all the big stuff. You missed all the things you should have been focusing about. It wasn't that the tithe was wrong or that they didn't have some obligation to a tenth. That's not the point. But instead, here's what they were doing in the text we've read. They were devouring widows' houses. But yet we've got the 10% of the deal ready to go and make our sacrifice. We start worrying about the little things without being sure that our life is in harmony with God's will. Oh, but I got my 10% of my spices ready to go. I've got all that little stuff. I focus on the little things, but I leave the major pillars undone. It wasn't that God didn't expect them to do things in the little ways, but they missed the opportunities that were before them in the weightier matters. Do I focus on the tiniest of detail? Do I see someone in need and not help them? Do I see someone that needs encouraging? I'm not there to encourage them. Those are weighty matters. Do I take care of those things? Are we being Pharisees? Focusing on the small things? Not the things that, I'm not saying they're completely unimportant, but we leave the major things of God undone? If we are, we're being like these scribes and Pharisees. Keep reading in verse 25 of Matthew 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup of the dish, but inside you're full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also. Let me just say, Jesus is not teaching them the proper way to wash dishes. But doesn't it make a whole lot of sense to go clean your cup and you clean the outside and you don't clean what's inside of it? He says, you know better than that. You don't go about cleaning your dish that way. Why do you focus on living your life that way? You give the show of the outside, but inside, what's really going on? You look the part, but the inside doesn't match. In verse 27, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! For you're like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they're full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. You may remember in the law, back in Numbers chapter 19, that if the Jew touched a grave, they were unclean for 7 days. So to understand that and what Jesus is talking about, where they would bury their dead, they would whitewash the tombs so that you didn't accidentally run into them. It's not like today Where you see on the news sometimes that someone found an abandoned cemetery. They did not do that. They were not going to take a chance of coming in contact with a grave and being unclean for 7 days. They were not going to do that. So they made sure that the outside of those graves was clearly identified. But guess what? Jesus says inside is just dead men's bones. The outside looks clean, it looks fresh, easily identified. It looks nice on the outside, but inside it's a stinking, decaying body. He said, that's what you're doing. That's how you're living. You are acting it on the outside, but you're polishing it up. But on the inside, you're rotten. You're not what you should be. We can be like the whitewashed tombs that he's talking about here. Outside looks great, but inside, the things in our hearts and in our minds, our dreams, our goals, our aspirations, are worldly. But we put on a facade of Christianity. Frankly, we've all been guilty of this to some extent at some point in time. We all claim to be Christians, and yet we've sinned. The question is, how do you address that? What do you do about that? Do we just go about living in hypocrisy? To continue to show righteousness, to give public displays of righteousness, but inside we do nothing? Or do we acknowledge it and do our best to uproot and outroot the sin that's in our lives and humble ourselves before God and recognize that I'm just a fellow servant with you of God? There are far too many examples that I guess we could talk about of people we probably know that gave us the outside facade and look of a Christian, but inside full of sin, with no acknowledgement if that's what was going on. I pray that's not us, and that we're humble enough to be able to look and say, I need to get better, and I need to get the sin out of my life. Now, a Christian's not a perfect person. If we're just interested in looking the part and that's it, woe be to us. Let's finish out the chapter in verse 29. It says, or at least down through our section. It says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we'd been living in the days of our fathers, we'd not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you'll scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. If I understand what he's talking about, this one may be the one that hits home. He's saying, here's how you act. You say, well, if I'd have been around back then, I'll tell you what, we wouldn't have acted that way. If I'd have been around when the prophets were around, we wouldn't have killed the prophets. I would have submitted myself to them. We do that. We say it in recent history, and some of you, not trying to pick, but some of you may have been around then, and said, if I'd have been around in the division in the 50s and the 60s, it wouldn't have happened. I'd have put a stop to it. Would you? We're foolish to act that way. If I'd have just been around in the late 80s, early 90s, when the big questions of marriage, divorce, and remarriage have been around, if I'd have been preaching then, I'd have settled it. Would I? We're foolish to think that way. To think that somehow we're superior to all those from years past. Here's the end point of it all. I can talk about what's happened in the past, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter to a hill of beans as to what's happening today. I can't be concerned about what happened in the 50s, and I can't be concerned about what happened in the 80s, and I can't be concerned about what happened in the 1900s, and then all the divisions and all the things that happened in the past. Here's what I can be concerned about. Right now, today, 2025, in Abilene, Texas. I can't do anything about the past. But I can recognize faithfulness and unfaithfulness today. And I can take a stand for truth today. I don't need to spend my life focusing on what happened in the past. I need to focus on what's happening right now, today. Look at Amos chapter 7. I always appreciate Amos. He's an interesting prophet at the least, but the way that this is put in Amos chapter 7 just really, it doesn't hit home to me or anything like that, but the way that he talks in Amos chapter 7 just makes us go, this is one of the prophets that Jesus is making reference of. All those prophets of the past, how did y'all treat them? How did you listen to them? Well, in Amos chapter 7 and verse 14, Amos replied to Amaziah, I'm not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet. That's kind of like saying, why are you getting on to me? I'm not a prophet. Is he? Yeah, he's a prophet. He's one sent by God as the spokesman of God. So he is a prophet, but what he's saying is not that. I'm not a prophet or the son of the prophet. I didn't get into this business. I didn't wake up one day and say, you know what? I'm making a career choice. I'm going to be a prophet of God. Notice what he says in the verse. I'm a herdsman and a grower of sycamore figs. You want to know who I am? That's who I am. I'm a herdsman. I'm not a prophet. I hadn't made a career out of this. I am just a herdsman and a grower of figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock. And the Lord said to me, go and prophesy to my people Israel. In other words, the Lord plucked me up and He wanted me to go about and do His business. He sent me to go and do His will. He doesn't think of Himself as a prophet. He just says, God said, you need to go about doing this. You need to come over here and say this. You need to come over here and tell these people this. And Amos is saying here in Amos chapter 7, that's what I did. It's kind of like he's saying, I'm nothing special. I'm just trying to do my best to serve God right now. Amos isn't saying, well, if I lived at some other time, I would have said this. If I lived at some other time, I would have done this. No, he says, I'm a shepherd and a grower of sycamore figs. And God told me to do this. That was his circumstance. He didn't make excuses. He just said, this is my job right now. And I'm going to get busy with what the Lord would have me to do right now. Seize the moment. Seize the opportunity that's before you today. Whatever circumstance we find ourselves in today, seize that. Be like Esther. Be like Daniel. We didn't live in Noah's day for us to boldly proclaim, I'd have gotten on the ark. We don't live then. We're not dealing with the situation that Noah was dealing with. I'm dealing with the situation right here and right now, and right here and right now is my chance to serve the Lord and do what I can for Him. Don't be like the Pharisees. They say, oh, if I lived back in the days of the prophets, I would have been on their side. We're living right here and we're living right now. And so look like and act like you're living right here and right now. Let's close in Luke chapter 11, please. Luke chapter 11. Jesus pronounced all those woes there in Matthew chapter 23. And what we get in Luke chapter 11 is we get to see their reaction. And this could be our reaction too. And so we'll close with it. Luke chapter 11, verse 53. When he left there, the scribes and the Pharisees began to be very hostile and to question him closely on many subjects, plotting against him to catch him in something he might say. You see, their way of reaction was hostility towards God. The other option, if there's just one to consider, is to admit there are things that I'm guilty of, and I need to get myself right with God. I need to improve. May that be our desire. When I recognize my faults before God, I submit myself and humble myself to Him to do His will. That should be all of our goal. Thank you for your good attention tonight. Also is going to lead us in the song of encouragement. And if we can help you in that service to your God and your Creator this evening, we want to be sure that we do that. If you need the prayers of the congregation, let us know. However it may be in a public manner, by coming to the front as we stand together and as we sing.